Hey guys, Cloud here. I'm looking a little different, aren't I? I finally have an update video for my endgame version of the Exploding Stampede build. I've been able to upgrade most of my gear, so I actually have a respectable amount of hit points now, just over 5,000. And I've decided to give up on the Perfect Strike Dream. It's been replaced now with Hammer of the Gods Ignite. But more on that later. If this is your first time learning about my Exploding Stampede build, or if you're still leveling, you might want to watch my leveling guide for the build first. That video explains its mechanics and how to level a character for it. But this video is about the endgame build. So, the first thing you might notice is that I've dropped Surrender. Ultimately, we don't really need it, as shown in my No Surrender Necessary, and even No Giant's Blood Necessary video. We're moving so much that we're ideally avoiding most of the swarm hits that it's best against. And it's of little use when fighting bosses who tend towards fewer, larger hits. By running a real rare shield, we can use its stats to fill out our necessary build targets, like resistances, in both our single target and clear weapon swap specs. And we get a lot more life and physical damage reduction to boot. If you're unfamiliar with the weapon swap spec concept, I also have a guide video for that you can check out. You might also notice this incredibly fashionable armor I'm now wearing. It's a 5-socket Morior Invictus, with 5% maximum life and 10% to all elemental resistances per socketed rune, which helps us get a respectable health pool, and helps efficiently fill out those resistance targets so that we can run other suffix modifiers on our rares, like Strength. I'm now getting Strength from every one of my rare slots, which lets me use a high strength hammer base so long as it has the Reduced Attribute Requirement suffix. In my Invictus and other sockets, I'm running Soul Cores which reduce the critical damage bonus of hits against me. I think this is an incredibly underrated stat, which almost everyone should be running. Deaths in PoE 2 are often the result of getting one-shotted, or receiving unpredictable burst. Nullifying crits will prevent them from one-shotting you, as well as make incoming damage more consistent in general. So I think these Soul Cores will have much more impact than simply socketing percent life or other options. I'm also taking Iron Reflexes, which converts Invictus's evasion rating into armor. And it seems that this works with the Stone Skin Ascendancy, so we can still get a respectable amount of armor, enough to help us mitigate the smaller physical hits we encounter during mapping. While armor isn't the greatest at mitigating large hits right now, it's still useful for reducing the damage we take during clear, especially those little hits we're vulnerable to during our windups. Ultimately, the raw value we get out of this chess piece simply outweighs any rare, especially since it's otherwise quite difficult to get percent life increases. Also, since I've dropped Spirit from my previous chess piece, I'm no longer running Berserk or Herbalism. Berserk was a nice bit of extra damage to have, but it wasn't strictly consistent, and the degen wasn't ideal, particularly since we're running Avatar of Fire and couldn't make up for the degen with the provided life leech from physical damage. I'm using the spare slot for Shield Charge now, purely as a burst speed movement utility. And supported by Ingenuity, the cooldown is brought down to a very comfortable level. It's been performing surprisingly well, and I should have really been using it sooner. Aside from making mapping much faster, it seems like it helps avoid a lot of projectile hits by charging right past them. Just be sure to curve your charges around enemies and not directly into them, just like you want to do with Stampede. Now, to wear Invictus, we do need some additional dexterity and intelligence. I'm getting that from my gear, 1 suffix each, and also some from pathing down to Polymathy. And, since we have some intelligence now, we can also run Flammability as a curse for another major fire damage boost. Aside from that, I'm running Zoth's Blood now, which is an effective clear speed increase since you don't need to heavy stun targets to achieve fire exposure, meaning stronger first hits and more one-hit kills. And it's generally a single target increase as well on tough bosses that take a long time to stun, meaning your exposure uptime would only be a small proportion of the fight if you were just using the fire exposure on heavy stun. Most importantly though, it has a major percent life boost you can amp even further with catalysts, and we really need that life to survive against dangerous bosses, and dangerous maps. As an anointment, I'm running Lay Siege. With a high block chance, it's just too much increased damage to pass up. I don't think there's really any other option that provides as much value. Otherwise, I've generally upgraded all of my gear to have, aside from strength on every slot, more resists, and more life. My gear isn't perfect, but perfect is an unrealistic goal. Last I checked, my perfect gloves aren't even available on trade. What I have is what I could get, working within my budget. I spent around 60 divines on this character, And with all that said, I think this is generally the final form of the build's gearing as I see it. There are probably some remaining optimizations to be made with unique jewels, but I'm happy with where the character is right now, especially for its investment. After gear, the other major change is that I've decided to drop Perfect Strike. I really liked the feeling of Perfect Strike, and I actually do still think it's my preferred choice for simple mapping. However, it's clear that standing still is simply not an acceptable strategy for endgame bossing, due to the bosses throwing out too many abilities at once for you to be able to get a channeled strike off safely. So it is with a heavy heart that I must admit I have joined the Hammer Gang. More precisely, our single target solution is now Hammer of the Gods Ignite. Hammer not only casts faster than a Perfect Strike channel, but you can cast it while moving, and as long as you don't whiff, it'll one-shot almost everything you come across. It'll one-shot +4 map bosses, even with the increased monster life modifier. It'll one-shot Citadel bosses, or at least each phase, like with this Doriani clone. This is actually my first and only Citadel I've found so far. It nearly one-shots Zarok for me, he just needed a little Culling Strike love tap at the end here. A slightly better damage roll would have probably done the trick. And it'll do a lot of damage to +4 Zesht. He seems quite a bit tougher than the other bosses I fought, but Hammer made him quite easy. Just dodge the mechanics, drop a couple more hammers on cooldown, and he's dead. The other important thing here is that Hammer is generally just much easier to use than Perfect Strike. Perfect Strike is a skill shot which you can not only miss time, but also literally miss if your aim is slightly off. And the channeled cast while standing still means you need to pay attention to timing and spacing in order to have your Perfect Strike going off just as your target enters range, which means it's very dependent on the player's skill to properly execute on in practice. But to use Hammer, you just simply max your Rage, Infernal Cry, Seismic if the target is stunned, cast Flammability, and drop the hammer. The only thing that can really go wrong is if you're up against a boss that likes to teleport around or move really quickly. Then you might miss, and that would be bad. But if you're careful with those enemies, then you won't have any issues. The downside to Hammer, of course, is the cooldown, which means sometimes you'll be stuck without it when coming up against sequences of rare monsters during mapping. But for where my character's damage is now at, Stampede alone is enough to take care of most rares, so this isn't a downside anymore at an endgame gear level. Here's my final gem setup for all skills. On Mace Strike, we have Overpower, Martial Tempo, Rage, Ruthless, and Culling Strike. Mace Strike is really just for building up stun on bosses, and then culling them once they're down at 5%. On Stampede, we have Armor Explosion, Magnified Effect, Fire Penetration, Elemental Focus, and Heft. Heft actually works even though we're converting our damage to fire. I'm not sure if it should work, but it does work. You can clearly see the damage increases. On Hammer of the Gods, we have Fist of War, Eternal Flame, Fire Infusion, Primal Armament, and Concentrated Effect. We're basically trying to maximize this damage as much as we can. One possible alternative is to use Rage Forged, which will give us more damage, but will require that we always have an extra 10 Rage in order to get the full benefit of the support gem on our hammer. On Infernal Cry, we have Premeditation, Enraged Warcry, Raging Cry, and Inspiration to reduce the mana cost. Infernal Cry is an enormous damage boost, giving us 150% damage as extra fire. This is one reason why I think Ignite is probably much more powerful than Bleed. Bleed has to deal with not going through Energy Shield, and it also doesn't benefit from Infernal Cry, since bleeding is only based off of your physical damage. And it requires you to invest a lot more in the passive tree just to ensure you bleed in the first place. And you have to worry about aggravating it. Ignite is much simpler and probably more powerful. On Seismic Cry, I'm running Dazing Cry, Corrupting Cry, and Physical Mastery, pretty much just because they slot in. These don't really do anything for the way that we use Seismic Cry, so they're not necessary. On Flammability, we're supporting it with Focused Curse, Heightened Curse, Persistence, and Arcane Tempo. which are all just marginal increases. Really the important one here is Heightened Curse for increased effect. You don't necessarily need to spend the extra currency on 5-linking this if you can't afford it. The important thing here is that you need a low-level flammability, because anything higher than your int requirement obviously won't be usable. On Shockwave Totem, we have Ancestral Urgency, Font of Rage, Font of Blood, and Ironwood. Really the important thing here is Ancestral Urgency so that you can actually cast it quickly, and then Font of Rage in order to pre-generate rage on bosses. On Shield Charge, we have Ingenuity, Stomping Ground, and Momentum. Once again, the Stomping Ground and Momentum don't really do anything here. They increase the damage a bit, but you're not really using Shield Charge to hit things anyways. So the important thing here is Ingenuity for increased cooldown rate, which will make the cooldown much more comfortable. For persistent buffs, we're running Scavenged Plating and Overwhelming Presence, and you can support either one with Cannibalism and Vitality. Cannibalism is essential for recovery during clear. It's a very large amount of life on kill. And Vitality is nice to have as regeneration, which makes more of a difference now that we have such a large life pool. And here's my passive tree at level 93. My last 3 points got me the Lightning Max Res nodes, so without those it's roughly a level 90 tree, which is quite reasonably achievable. The main differences from my previous iteration of the build are the switch from defensive to more offensive nodes on the single target tree, and for the universal tree, pathing all the way down to Polymathy to get us more attributes for running Invictus. We were already down there for the AoE nodes, so for a few minimal additional points we can not only get Iron Reflexes, but a powerful Jewel Socket along the way to these attribute nodes. And since we're getting strength on all of our gear, we can afford the points by removing the strength-only nodes we were previously taking. Some block nodes have also been dropped. Capped block is not at all a necessity, and frankly even high block is more of a nice to have. We don't strictly need it to survive, and we don't want to rely on it anyways since it's just avoidance, and won't guarantee safety against a bad string of unlucky hits. And since we no longer combo Perfect Strike with Hammer for single target, we no longer need Cranial Impact for the extra empowerment. In general, this tree takes a bit less stun buildup than the previous tree, which is not an issue for my current damage output. I'm still fully capable of one-hit explosions during clear. So all in all, we now have a character that is quite tough, capable of surviving most mapping, and even one-shotting a lot of bosses. Stacking multiple deadly damage mods in tier 18s will still get you killed, but outside of that, it's pretty smooth sailing. I hope you all have enjoyed the progression of this build as much as I have. If there are any future major updates, I'll certainly let you know. Now then, I think it's time to level an alt. I do want to try to build a physical Stampede version as a Warbringer, but I also want to explore other classes and weapon types, so I might do that a bit first before returning to Warrior. Until next time, Exiles.